right, welcome to part 2, note 6-1, the Great Depression, at least the causes in the beginning of the Great Depression. We got more of it. It's not going to be over by the time these notes are over, sorry. So we're going to start here with what the government did try to do. They didn't try to do much. Hoover tried to keep out of this as much as he could, which is why people like the gangster Al Capone had to set up soup kitchens for the unemployed in Chicago. It wasn't Al Capone in New York and Philadelphia and these other big cities, but it was, in some of them it was, good charities or churches, but in some of the areas it was that old political machine, some of that organized crime that had come up since Prohibition. So, one of the first things the Hoover government tries to do in 1930, months later, almost a year later, Hoover wants to put these protective tariffs on American goods to try and get people to buy American. If you're buying from American companies, then the American companies are going to make money, and then they're going to be able to hire more people, and then those people are going to be able to spend more money places, and those businesses are going to make money, and they're going to be able to hire people, and we'll be able to get out of this unemployment trap. That was the biggest problem with the Great Depression, was the unemployment rate. Stock market can come and go, but you need employment. You need for there to be employment to get out of any kind of rough economy. So that was Hoover's plan. And it's not a terrible plan, but it runs into some snags. And this is the bill. You might see this on the STAR test, the Hawley-Smoot tariff, or the Smoot-Hawley tariff. Sorry, the donkey has it Hawley-Smoot, but the history book has it Smoot-Hawley. Either way, Smoot-Hawley tariff. This is one of those ones that will sometimes show up on the STAR test. So as you can see, on the side of the donkey, you have Hawley-Smoot bill to aid the farmer, right? And Congress is standing there, all happy with themselves, and they've got their top hat and fancy coat on, and clearly they're eating well. So the point of this is to aid the farmer. We're going to help people out. And here's the farmer going, well, I wonder how much this animal eats. And on the teeth of the donkey is a higher tariff on what the farmer buys. Because when you put a tariff on other countries, if you put taxes, special taxes on stuff brought in from other countries, those countries are probably going to put tariffs, special taxes on stuff your people sell to them. And some of the biggest customers for the American farmers are other countries that buy our food. And so it was expensive for them to buy their farming equipment from other countries, and they made less money selling to these other countries. So this tariff bill that was supposed to help out farmers and help out American businesses and get people their jobs back ended up backfiring. So if you're keeping a little STAR question journal, Smoot-Hawley tariff backfires, hurts the American farmer. And that's really bad for a lot of reasons, but personally for Herbert Hoover, he was elected by farmers. It was farmers that elected him. So if his plan fails and it hurts farmers even more, that's not a good look. That is in fact a very bad look. Let me get that out of the way. Sorry. And about a year later, 1931, a drought hits the Midwest, Kansas, Kentucky, Nebraska. And, that area was called the breadbasket of America, because that's where we were growing all of our wheat for our bread. And a lot of other crops as well. Corn was a popular one. And the Dust Bowl, ate up all those crops. Crops couldn't grow in the dust. The dust would cover the crops and make them impossible. So we end up having a food shortage all over the country. So we have a job shortage. There's not enough jobs. We have a money shortage. There's not any money. A lot of the banks have closed, except in Louisiana because of Huey Long. We'll talk about him. And not so much today, but we'll talk about him later. And now we have a food shortage and a farmer shortage, and things just keep getting worse and worse and worse. And if you're like, why is there this big dust bowl? Why is there this big drought now? Why does all this happen? I remember dry farming a few decades ago when they settled this area. There wasn't enough water, so they dug really deep down into the ground to get the water that was down there. Turns out that water was supplying sort of the bare minimum of plant life to keep the topsoil in place. Yeah. So over farming the area and dry farming the area had really destroyed the topsoil. And for those of you that have a farming background, you know that when the topsoil goes, the rest of that stuff can just be swept away by the rain or the wind, and you just end up with dust. If you saw the movie Interstellar, I think it was, with Matthew McConaughey and some other people as well. And that whole like beginning part where the Earth has these huge dust storms, and they had those interviews at the beginning on the TVs like, oh, I remember when this happened, and it was these old people, and they didn't actually get a bunch of old actors to read that part. They just used archival footage from documentaries of people talking to the survivors of the Dust Bowl. So those bits at the beginning of Interstellar with the people talking, like in the documentary style, those are from real documentaries from real people that survived this. So if you haven't seen Interstellar, it's a super good science fiction movie. If you have seen it, if you give it a rewatch, that bit at the beginning, those are real people that lived through this. Should give you a little more context. So no topsoil can stop further erosion, so dust storms just choke out the farmers, they choke out the crops. This is what one of those abandoned farms looks like after a few dust storms. They did not bury that car on purpose. It just got buried, along with the wagon, along with the other tractors and stuff you can see in the background. Rough time. So with all of that in mind, in 1932, there's an election coming up later this year. Things have gone from bad to worse, and then from worse to even worse. No jobs, no money, no food, no farms, right? I mean, there were some, but a lot of them had been wiped out. A lot of them had been taken away. And so Hoover's sort of last-ditch effort, because again, he doesn't want the government to get too involved. He thinks, the market needs to fix itself. But the government can get a little bit involved. And so Hoover puts together the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. This is his last plan. This is what's going to end the Great Depression. We are going to give out loans to banks and businesses. Not people, not individuals, not families, but we're going to give money to banks and businesses, and they were hoping that if we give money to those banks will start loaning money to people to start new businesses, to build houses, to, do the things people need to do with bank loans. And then if you, get a loan from the bank to build a house, well, that's jobs for construction workers and an architect and a realtor. And if enough people are building houses and starting new businesses, that's jobs that are getting created, and those people get paid, and they'll spend their money, and those businesses will make more money and hire more people. So like he had a plan. Like this wasn't just the worst idea ever, but it didn't really work because people were so starved for cash. These banks and these businesses that still existed were so starved for cash, they just kind of hoarded it. And they gave a few loans out, and they might have hired a couple of new people, but they were panicking. They were afraid. They didn't think they'd have enough. So that didn't really work out. And then what really didn't work out was the bonus army. So for those of you that have seen stuff on the news, protesters and clashes with the police and, different protest groups fighting each other in the streets, and a few people have even been killed in some of those conflicts. And you might be thinking, oh my gosh, America's falling apart. This has never happened on the streets of America. Yeah, it has. It has. It's been a while. It's absolutely been a while. And it's happened, in between 1932 and 2020. It's happened before. But this is the big one. Like, until we get to this level, I'm not going to run around panicking about how America's falling apart. We're going through some rough times. We're figuring things out, but I don't think we're going to fall apart because of any of the stuff we've seen. So let me tell you the story of the bonus army. World War I veterans are in a rough place like everybody else. They don't have jobs. They don't have, their savings account got wiped out in the, bank failures. They're unemployed and they're in rough shape. But there's some hope. You see, World War I vets had been paid for their time in World War I as soldiers, and they had been promised a bonus in 1945. So it's 1932. The bonus is still, about a decade away, a little over a decade away, but maybe they can convince the government to pay them their bonus now, and they can save their house, and they can buy some food for their family, and maybe they can use that money to get a job somehow, so they can really kind of get settled in. And the government was like, no, we'll pay you in 45. The contract says 45, we'll pay you in 45. So a bunch of them show up in Washington, D.C., and they set up camps, literal, you can see the tent there, literal camps they set up outside the White House in Washington, D.C., outside Congress, trying to demand that they get their money now. And Herbert Hoover's response to this was to send the current army. I mean, they tried sending the police in, and clearly that that didn't work super well, as you can see here. I mean, for either side, I'm not saying, the police just got beat and had to leave. I mean, it was pretty rough on both sides. And they couldn't get them out, and they couldn't, the bonus army wasn't getting what they wanted. The police weren't able to get them out, so Herbert Hoover calls in the current army with tanks to disperse the bonus army. And the bonus army gets dispersed, and they flee, and they basically end up, heading back home. But I mean, that's almost another civil war, right? If things had gone differently, you have veterans fighting against the current military on the streets of Washington, D.C. Kind of makes you wonder how the current army felt about it. They had their orders, sure, but these are veterans. And we're getting promised by the government we're going to get paid, but we're sending these guys away because they want to get paid like the government promised them. It's got to feel a certain way. But yeah, we had tank battles on the streets of Washington, D.C. Now, the veterans didn't have tanks. Yeah. So, if it gets that bad, we'll talk about how rough it's, it's rough now. I'm not trying to deny that. I'm not trying to minimize anything. But, that's a thing that our country goes through from time to time, and we've gone through worse. Because this was pretty bad. So let's take a look at the art of the Great Depression. It's a bit different than the art of the Roaring Twenties and the Harlem Renaissance that we talked about. You have a few different types of art kind of going on during this time period. You have sort of this realism, like what is really happening in the country. And Dorothea Lange, I'd say 7 out of 10, 8 out of 10, she's going to be on the STAR test. There's a ton of other artists around this time period too, but she ends up getting top billing a lot of the times because she was a phenomenal photographer. And she didn't photograph rich people or powerful people or people at parties or people in the government. She photographed everyday Americans. And this one, you have this immigrant mother with her children, and you can see the worry on her face, and you can see the lines in her face, and you can see just how real this is. She's not made up. This isn't a glamour shot. There's no filters on this. She's not being made to look pretty or beautiful. I mean, she's certainly not an ugly person by any stretch of the imagination, but like, this is rough. What she's going through is rough. Her kids are in rough shape. She's in rough shape. And this, photographs from Dorothea Lange and other photographers and other artists from this time period really show you how bad things were. On the other hand, you have escapism. And just, things are terrible. Things are really bad. Let's just go to the movie for an hour and escape the Great Depression. So The Wizard of Oz, here's an old movie poster. Judy Garland and Frank Morgan, Ray Bolger, Burt Lahr, Jack Haley. Those are big names at the time. Of those names, you might know Judy Garland at this point. You might not know the rest of these names, and that's okay. So for those of you that haven't seen it, The Wizard of Oz is the story about a girl from Kansas that gets swept up in the tornado, and she has to help the American farmer, the American industrial worker, and William Jennings Bryan, fight back against John D. Rockefeller and other industrialists. That's actually the plot of The Wizard of Oz. Now you might be thinking, but what about the Scarecrow? You mean the American farmer? And what about the Tin Man? The American industrial worker, the factory worker? And the Cowardly Lion? William Jennings Bryan? And what about the Wicked Witch of the West? John D. Rockefeller? It's a political allegory. Everything about The Wizard of Oz is about the politics of this time period. Seriously, go back. Compare it. It's not exactly the whole, watching the movie while you sync it up with Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon album, but, this is an allegory of the politics happening at the time. There's a reason there's a tornado in Kansas. It's the Dust Bowl. It all lines up, I promise. Don't believe me, look it up yourself. Another bit of fantasy and escape was Walt Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. This is their first feature-length animated film. And this thing goes wild. People are lined up around the block to see this movie. They see it over and over again. And this is that escapism. Things are bad, but we can go pretend things are okay for a little while by watching a play, or going to this movie, or seeing this new art style that's super escapist in nature. Not the Dorothea Lange stuff. That's real. And there was definitely that vein of real artwork at the time. Another movie of the time period, very popular, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. This is Jimmy Stewart. You may have seen him in It's a Wonderful Life. I want to live, Clarence. I want to live. That guy. He plays this common dude that's almost accidentally elected to the Senate, to the U.S. Senate, and he goes to the Senate, and he's all, idealistic and ready to change things and ready to help people out. And then he gets there, and everything is corrupt. Nobody cares. Nobody's helping anybody. There's all these backroom deals to make themselves richer and to help their friends get rich, and not to help the average person. So Jimmy Stewart, being the common man, he fights back for the common man against the political bosses, and he wins. What's the big, climax of the movie is when he's giving this filibuster, and he's talking about, how losing battles are the only battles worth fighting for. And he gets people the help that they need. Not a bad movie. It's an old movie. It's not going to be exciting or explosions and stuff like movies we know today. But it's not a bad movie. And a little bit of foreshadowing for what's coming up next. There was the political wisdom of the time, because of how bad the Great Depression got, is that whoever ran for president in 1928, when Herbert Hoover ran and won, would lose the election in 1932. If things get that bad on your watch, you're going to lose the next election. That's something we see a few times in U.S. history. Usually, if a president runs for re-election, they get it. Jimmy Carter with the gas crisis. We'll get to that when we get to the 1970s. George H.W. Bush, the economy wasn't that bad underneath him, but Clinton was just a really charismatic guy. And things weren't great under George W. Bush. Gerald Ford pardoned Nixon. People never really forgave him for that. So this happens. And with Herbert Hoover, the Great Depression happened. And it wasn't really his fault. He didn't do it. And, he tried a couple of times to help. He could have maybe tried harder. He could have done other things. But our man Franklin Delano Roosevelt coming up next. So that's it for today, right? Yep. Take care of yourself. Again, I'm not looking for likes, shares, or subscribes, or whatever. So just get some sleep tonight, and we'll see you next time. Take care.